Episode 1. Pilot. A tall, solemn man stood at the head of his modest ship, at the head of his modest fleet. He wore 2 long, thick black braids, parted to frame his face and fall on his shoulders, like any respectable gentleman of the day, but now they were violently flapping in the stiff western wind. On the horizon to the north, he had his first glimpse of Arcadia, the land he would pioneer, dancing in an orange-lit sunrise. Its massive peaks offended the sky, its rolling hills looked barren of crop, and so proved true of the stories he had heard about this peninsula on the edge of the world. A land of pastoralists, sparse and few, a people lacking gunpowder. This was the final frontier. Soin had been born with noble blood, but hadn't learned it until he was a young man. Fostered and forgotten by his father, the king of a growing empire, the exiled prince was discovered as the only living heir to the throne on his father's death. Soin was plucked from his modest hosts as a young man and forced to fight his father's wars of reunification to a broken empire, war-torn between claimants to the throne. When the wars proved unfruitful and unification proved impossible, Soin traded his old world for a new one, shirking all responsibility. His father's comrades were left behind to fight for supremacy in the old lands to the south, while he and his band of loyal retainers set sail for a new beginning, due northeast, toward an ancient and sacred peninsula on the edge of their continent, at the edge of their world, Arcadia. Scout ships were sent ahead into the folds of land to probe for danger. Cannon blanks were fired at 3-minute intervals to announce the presence of a new power in the land. Danger was not expected, but the cannon fire drew pastoralist attention to the presence of the fleet. Many curious pastoralists on the coast were driven to the explosive sound. To them, it didn't signify danger. Not yet. It reminded them of the ceremony drum. A meeting was held between Soin and some local chiefs on the grassy northwestern coast of the newfound land. Pleasantries were exchanged, goods were traded, technologies swapped, and communication attempted. A famous 6-week-long feast set in as more chiefs from distant regions of Arcadia heard of the new alien spectacle and travelled to see it. Every chief or representative of a chief brought offerings in the form of cattle and trinkets, all pleading with the foreign spectacle for the same unintelligible thing. Giant enclosures had to be built on the coast to contain the live offerings. Linguists were present in Soin's fleet to study the new language, but effective drawings and games of charades were exchanged too. It was discerned that what the Arcadian chiefs wanted was freedom from their long-time overlords, a violent group of unified pastoralists living in the north they called the Hukals. Soin's thunderous arrival gave rise to dreams of freedom, or at least dreams of more benevolent overlords. The Hukals rode down into Arcadia twice a year, demanding tribute in slaves and cattle. Any resistance to their excessive demands would be met with violence and wide loss of life. Thus, twice a year the scattered tribes of Arcadia would be left hungry, poor and dishevelled. The tribes of Arcadia were, to the Hukals, no more than flocks of people to be farmed. In fact, powerful Hukal leaders owned the rights to tax and raid their own domains in Arcadia. Every Hukal knew his share and descended on it in fury twice a year. Every Hukal knew to leave the Arcadians with enough souls and cattle to promote growth for their next reaping. The Hukals were due to arrive soon, at the start of the waning season, the time of year when all rooted things begin to brown, wither and crack in the blistering sun, but when flocks were at their most abundant. The waxing season, the fair time of year when rooted things again spring out of the ground and choke out their withered, dry parents of yesteryear, was coming to an end. Bodies, privileged from a season of ceaseless plenty, would be fat and healthy now, sufficient for beating back the now suffocating empire of grass and trees. Tribal flocks were abundant and strong, ripe for the taking and fit for a long migration north. This was the season when war happened, when every soul of the earth scrambled for enough to last the waning season. The Hukals would descend from their lofty northern steppe in droves as soon as the grass began to brown. The Hukals would come again, desperate, slow and hungry at the end of the waning season too, looking for the easy pickings of what was left among the Arcadian tribes. It was a poor affair, but one that could not be resisted. Not until now. The wind blew cold and stiff over the wolds of northern Arcadia, a rude and unforgiving region, barren of trees but choked with razor-sharp prairie grass. This was the start of the northern steppe and the site of Soin's first colony. Not a favourable spot for resources or comfort, but a favourable spot to win the approval of Arcadia's tribes. The narrowest part of the peninsula here offered a most favourable choke point in which to stage a halt to the Hukal advance. There was a new power in the land, and the Hukals should think twice before descending on their human flocks this season. It had been a long voyage, sailing back south down Arcadia's west coast, around the southern cape and back north along her eastern side, that the wide, unfordable northern river emptying into the east coast, learned to be called the Hunu, offered the deepest probe inland for Soin's fleet to anchor. It was at the head of the river Hunu where Soin's fleet would build their first colony, Hunu Head, and from the head of that river to the western coast they would begin to build a monumental wall to keep out the Hukals once and for all. It began as nothing more than an earthen rampart and moat, not more than 8 feet high, but over the years it would grow to sport a domineering face of wooden palisades and guard patrols, forever beckoning the Hukals to turn back. Soin's colony was built outside of a massive ring of earth, next to the river Hunu, after the style of Arcadia's waning season settlements. In the waning season, the tribes of Arcadia would herd their flocks into the lowlands near the rivers, where the last and most base fruits of the earth would cling to receding water. Flocks would forage along the river by day and be corralled into impressive earthen rings at night, their shepherds retiring to tents just outside. River bracken was enough to sustain only the hardiest cattle through the waning season, but the less fit would be slaughtered and eaten. In the waxing season, when trees and fruits of the earth began to grow and choke out living and foraging space in the lowlands, the tribes would migrate to the sparser highlands for pasturage and store their cattle in their highland corrals at night. The cycle continued, year after year. It was fitting for Soin to build his first colony with an earthen corral then. He knew all kingdoms start as businesses, so he would go into the business of defence. The tribes of Arcadia would be shielded from the wrath of the Hukals through this coming waning season by Soin and his colony's superior arms. In exchange, Soin and his colony would get all they asked for in tribute of cattle, clothes, wood and slaves to build the wall. His corral would hold this tribute. As colony grew into town, business would grow into state, and Soin could begin demanding the fealty of tribes, using them to man the wall, build more towns, and put the land to plough. It wouldn't be long before Arcadia would be turned into a proper society of obligation and patronage, the only system Soin knew. At the top of the world, Soin and his brave but small colony sat. They watched and waited for the Hukals in shifts, riding out along the developing walls, cannon wicks and musket matches primed. Sweat and dedication went into that wall, and when it finally reached from river to sea, no Hukal horde had yet crested the horizon of grass to the north. A dreadful silence set in as the wall neared completion. Waning season had well begun, and hordes of savages had yet to descend into Arcadia. The slightest noise agitated the ears, and eyes winced at every disturbance. The thunder of hooves was anticipated because the might of Soin's small colony would be tested. If they failed, their bodies would be forgotten at the edge of the world. If they triumphed, they would have a new life ruling over these sorry tribes to the south. The night watch hummed with activity. One moment, movement was seen on the grassy horizon. The next, fires were lit on the outstretched plain before the eastern section of the wall. 10, then 20, then 40 fires blazed, signifying at most a horde of 200. It was nothing Soin's colony of 74 foreigners behind a wall and a handful of Arcadians couldn't handle. The Hukals either seemed to have no regard for the new wall, or they did not see it in the moonlight. It was assumed they were setting their final night camp before their descent into Arcadia come daybreak. Tents were erected without a care in the world. Their strange voices, uplifted in song, echoed faintly across the plain. A meeting was held in Soin's colony as to what should be done. It was expected that the Hukals would try to overrun the wall with their bows and spears immediately, not arrive at night and taunt them. It was decided that this opportunity of delay should be capitalized on for a chance to make a display of force. Perhaps the colony wouldn't have to fight. Soin's ships carried enough oil for modest torches to be passed and lit along the wall's length throughout the night, making the barrier to Arcadia clear to the Hukals. But the Hukals' songs didn't even quiet. When a quick display of cannon blanks were fired, however, as a warning to the Hukals of the danger that lay ahead, all song and cheer in the Hukal camp stopped. A small delegation of 3 men, it was decided, should be sent out of the colony to the Hukal camp to negotiate a retreat and gain intelligence on enemy numbers and attitude. Such was the way things were done in the south. Diplomacy must prevent war, if it could. It was dawn. Nights during the waning season were short, and the delegation had been gone too long. Daybreak could mean trouble, and the colony would not open fire on their own. It was decided they should be called back soon. As the sun heaved itself above the horizon, a new but smaller drove of Hukals, not more than 40 strong, was spotted, lingering on the plain just beyond the western section of the wall, with no intention of making camp. Riders reported this to Soin back in the colony, and it was taken as a sign to call in the delegation and prepare for battle. Another delegation was sent out to the Hukal camp to recall the first, but as the second delegation rode out to retrieve their brothers, sounds of gunfire echoed out across the plain, coming from the western wall. The battle had begun. The Hukals of the larger camp, it was noticed, began fleeing in great haste at the sound of echoing gunfire from the west. Rather than join their brothers, they abandoned their mighty camp in terror. A rapturous applause went up along the eastern wall. The booming echoes from the western wall tailed off as quickly as they had begun, and then subsided altogether. A ride and report followed that the western horde of Hukals charged the wall, but had been repelled into a terrified retreat, with a handful shot down. Their riderless horses now captured, safe behind the wall. Curiously, it was observed that the Hukal horse was 3-toed, horned, squat and spotted, as opposed to the sleeker, 2-toed, striped breed of the south, familiar to the colonists. With both Hukal hordes out of sight and half the day gone by, the wall's eastern gates were proudly flung open and most of Soin's fighting men were paraded out. The first delegation sent out never returned, but the second delegation had come back with the riches it could carry from the empty Hukal camp, and it was all too valuable. Soin's collected colony couldn't resist venturing out to loot the abandoned Hukal camp for all it was worth. It contained a tempting reserve of horses, cattle, felts, expensive fabrics, exotic jewellery, and fresh meats and cheeses, all of which the Hukals willingly parted with in their panic to escape the distant gunfire. Screams, fumbling, smoke, blood. The men of the steppe returned in an instant. The foreign colonists, lured out into this alien plain, found themselves surrounded by a hurricane of mounted savages and pin-pricked with arrows. Where the Hukals fled, no one knew, but they didn't retreat. They hid and waited, behind hills perhaps, but the wall guard watched the Hukals retreat out of sight before they struck out to loot their camp. Now, the Hukals rose up out of the very folds of the land, out of the grass itself, it seemed. Soin's colony had been outwitted. They fought until the last, firing at a rate inferior to the bow, encircled by running figures of horse and man, but the steppe grass drank foreign blood that day. In the next instant, the Hukals stormed the wall and charged through the open gate meant to receive the returning colonists, spreading out onto the plain of northern Arcadia like so many locusts taking flight. Those left in the colony ran, but felt the suffocating rug burn of lasso around neck. Arcadia would have to face the wrath of its Hukal overlords another year. The gate to Soin's wall was barred open over the next moon cycle, as horde after Hukal horde streamed into Arcadia to do their biannual business. Confusion turned into woe for every tribe of Arcadia when they reconnected with their familiar overlords. All of Soin's ships were left to rot at the head of the Hunu except one. A modest cargo vessel, barley stocked, skimmed the waves southbound, back toward the warring kingdom of Unu. Aboard, against all odds, was Soin, now surely having earned a notorious reputation for running from his problems.